Welcome to the TOD Forum on parking, the impacts of parking reform in the Twin City region. My name is Lucy Galbraith. I'm the Director of Transit-Oriented Development at Metro Transit and Met Council. And as a lot of you know, the Metro Transit TOD office does a lot of different things, including leasing land to the soccer stadium people over in St. Paul, and also just doing some research and best practices online and posting things like our public property database, which is user-friendly. So I encourage everybody to go check out our website. But today we're focusing on something that we in TOD world call the P word. It's parking. It's always a problem, it's always a challenge, and there are a lot of new ideas about how to deal with an old topic. So we have a really expert panel. I trust all of you got the program on the way in. If you'll look on the back and read their really impressive bios, I would appreciate it. And before I introduce our panel, I want to turn the microphone over to our very gracious host, Nick Koch.
Thank you, Lucy. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Hey, folks in the back, the seats in the front are way more comfortable if you're in the mood or if you're just coming in. They swivel and they're cushy. And if you were in an airplane, you'd be paying extra. That's all I'm saying. My job today is just to make you feel welcome, to have a little fun with the topic of parking. And since we aren't presenting, I've got to show you just a few pictures really fast because architects have to show pictures. And because what I want to do is help us all think differently or expand our vision of what transit-oriented development is, because TOD is all around us. We may not just always think of it. So let me press a button. Yeah, you all know this, right? Especially the architects in the room. This was the mantra that we were trained in architecture history. And this was a great. But I want you to know, when I was in architecture school, somebody wrote this on one of the studio walls. And developers, architects, you know this is really the truth, right? So, and that's the topic today. So I just want us to think about where we are in TOD. We're in a transit-oriented development. More people work here in this building today than when it was a Ford factory. And thank you for all the transit. And that's why we chose this site. So just thoughts about transit and what transit-oriented development is. Thank you, Hennepin County Metro Transit and the Twins and everybody who contributed to this beautiful development. And here's another one at the other end of that same green line. Hey folks, this is TOD. And we did this in the height of the recession and brought back a lot of jobs. So thank you to that administration and the Recovery Act. And there's a whole lot of modes of transit here. And I hear that Lowertown is hopping, and I hope that this helps the east side. We can be audacious and think about transit in a different way. Transit-oriented development can be something small scale and intimate, or it can be very audacious and way big. And you know, even my favorite radio station is a TOD workplace. And it worked out. Now, this is kind of fun. This is a workplace too, although we may wonder how it's going there at times. But that's an office building with a lot of meeting rooms. And I think in conclusion, we're going right to our panelists. There you go. Thank you for coming. Well.
Thank you. So I'm going to take for granted that most people in this room are probably comfortable with the fact that in an urban environment, there are people who are going to park in front of your house and that you're okay with that once in a while. If you're not okay with that, some of what I'm going to show you is going to make you a little uncomfortable. And I have to say that I'm not completely unsympathetic to people who live in a truly, really tight parking environment where it makes it difficult for friends, family, others to come visit them and park within a reasonable distance. I think that is a legitimate livability issue, but public streets are meant, in many cases, to serve a parking purpose as well. And that is kind of part of the philosophy that underlies some of what I'm going to show you. So a bit of background. The second Minneapolis zoning code was adopted in 1963 after the first one was way back in 1924. The 1963 code brought minimum parking requirements, and we're currently under our third zoning code adopted in 1999. That actually didn't change parking requirements to any significant degree. It made some improvements but for the most part left a lot of that 1963 work intact. Over the course of the past decade, however, we've been working on incrementally revising our off-street parking standards to align better with our policies. So this list of 4 actions isn't kind of the complete parking reform compendium that we've had over the past decade or so, but it kind of represents the most significant changes we've made. I'm going to talk mostly about the first 2 from 2009 to 2015, and those kind of represent the most seismic shifts that we've had in terms of off-street parking policy. So we took our first big step in Minneapolis in this area in 2009, focused largely on commercial uses, as well as completely eliminating parking requirements from our downtown districts, which extend into the North Loop a bit. We're in a downtown zoning district right here. Also extends about over to 35W, roughly to the Convention Center and to Washington Avenue. That's roughly kind of the area where we completely eliminated off-street parking requirements for every use. We also established maximum parking requirements at that time, citywide, as well as minimum bicycle parking requirements. So fortunately, from a standpoint of good urbanism, Minneapolis did benefit, dating back to '63, from having relatively modest minimum parking requirements for smaller scale uses. We've had a fairly unique provision that essentially allows you to subtract out the first 4,000 square feet of commercial space from your minimum parking requirement, as long as you provide at least 4 spaces. So for a 4,000 square foot retail or office building, we've only historically required 4 spaces. So again, for smaller scale uses, compared to many places, that's a pretty low off-street parking requirement. Restaurants, on the other hand, we really hammered with high parking requirements. They of course have higher peak parking demands typically. We required an awful lot of parking for restaurants. You can see in the charts, we don't regulate minimum parking requirements quite the same way that we used to prior to 2009, but for a small scale restaurant of 1,000 square feet with 450 square feet of public area, that would have required 9 spaces, which of course takes up more space than the actual restaurant itself. Today, that same restaurant wouldn't require any parking by city ordinance. A larger scale restaurant, 3,000 square feet, a little less than half of that public area, would have required 27 spaces prior to 2009. Today would require 7 in much of the city, less than that in some parts of the city. So we've had a pretty big restaurant boom in the past 10 years, and that absolutely would not have been possible had we not made those changes to our off-street parking standards. The Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal recently put together some info about restaurants that have opened over the course of the past 10 years based on licensing data, and we, over the past 10 years, have had 1 new restaurant open every 3 days on average. Again, that would never have been possible based on our old parking requirements for those uses. So we've come a long way. Of course, when you subtract out 4,000 square feet from a building that's about 900,000 square feet, that's sort of a drop in the bucket. So a building like this, back when it was proposed, and this was in a downtown district, at the time I think was called the American Express Client Services Center. It's the building with the kind of the fun Maya Lin sculpture and water cascading down the front. That required 649 spaces under city ordinance at the time when it was proposed. They asked for a variance, received it, built 384 spaces. Today, that same building has a minimum parking requirement of 0. 2015, we focused a lot on multifamily residential uses, particularly in transit corridors, establishing more flexible minimums for those uses. I didn't include a map, but it includes areas that within a quarter mile of frequent bus stops, with frequent transit service with bus stops, and within a half mile of rail transit stops with frequent service. That covers a pretty significant percentage of the city and a pretty significant percentage where we've actually been seeing a lot of development in recent years. So if you can maybe read the table, maybe not, but for projects over 50 units in those areas, we now require 1 space for every 2 units. For projects of less than 50 units, there's no minimum parking requirement in those areas. The building Chroma is pictured here in the Whittier neighborhood. They built 70 units and ground floor commercial space, provided 46 off-street parking spaces. That would not have been a thing in that neighborhood 10, 15 years ago. So a little bit of context. We, of course, as people in this room know, have been experiencing a bit of a residential boom. Over $1 billion of construction valuation for quite a few years in a row now. Over the past 6 years, shown here, we've averaged about 2,800 new housing units per year. The population of Minneapolis, a quote, fully developed city, is outpacing the population growth of the state of Minnesota, which I think is kind of fascinating. That, of course, wasn't the case for many, many decades. The Met Council just released, I think just yesterday, population numbers dating back to 2000 and noted that Minneapolis has added 46,000 people since the beginning of 2000. At the same time, we still have a housing shortage with vacancy rates quite low. That puts landlords in the driver's seat. Rents have been rising. Just kind of puts a finer point on the fact that we are in a position where it's much more important that we house people than providing new places to store vehicles. This is a chart that was put together by one of our now former planning commissioners, Nick Magrino. He pulled together these figures dating back to 2012, so back before we adopted the residential parking reform. It excludes, for various reasons, the university area and the downtown area, which are sort of unique submarkets in terms of parking for various reasons. Each red bar represents a 6-month increment, so sometimes a particularly large project can throw off one of those half years. But you can see the clear trend line was to go from an average of more than 1 space per unit back in 2012 to significantly less than 1 space per unit now. This is just a similar look at similar data. This covers the whole city, though, dating back to 2015 when we did the residential parking reform in transit corridors. Again, covering the whole city. And the data that we've produced shows that for all projects, all multifamily projects citywide, the median project in terms of their parking supply is now providing 0.82 parking spaces per dwelling unit. So for your typical 100-unit building, they're providing 82 parking spaces, in other words. For smaller scale projects, again, those less than 50 units that in many places no longer have a parking requirement, 0.42, so less than half a parking space per dwelling unit on average. And you can see a project here in the North Loop, 71 units, 44 parking spaces. So we're finding that these lower parking requirements are opening up opportunities to develop this kind of missing middle type of project. So Truly, as Nick noted, form has followed parking, and that now has been less so in recent years. You don't necessarily have to start with the fact that the city is requiring you to provide parking for every dwelling unit. I'll add more during our discussion, but for now, I'll turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Jennifer Jordan. I work for the City of Brooklyn Park. So I am coming at this from a suburban context to kind of counterbalance Jason's urban core presentation. So if you don't know it already, Brooklyn Park is getting an extension of the LRT line from this station right here. So the image on the left shows you the Brooklyn Park stations in red. 5 stations in a suburban context in a community that doesn't have a lot of transit. It does have some bus service, but so this is a really transformative and a changing environment for a heavily auto-oriented community. With that being said, our station areas range from existing kind of auto-oriented big box all the way to greenfield development. So we kind of have a whole range of development possibilities that can happen as the train gets closer and when it's in operation. So this image just kind of gives you a sense of the land use planning that took place as part of station area planning. As I said, 5 stations, 63rd Avenue, which is right along Bottineau Boulevard. There's an existing park and ride there. It kind of mirrors a similar context that Hiawatha would have with a large, very heavily used arterial roadway. Brooklyn Boulevard is our big box area. It has a lot of surface parking, so there's some opportunities for potential redevelopment because that parking is really underutilized. 85th is a station area that has a large community college and library, and so there's already a large potential for pedestrians as students switch over from driving their cars to school to being able to take the train. 93rd Avenue is a high job area, but right now, most folks have to drive to get there, so we see this as a real transformative area for people getting to those high-paying jobs. And then finally, Oak Grove, where there is the Target campus north, and essentially 400 acres of greenfield for development. So what drove the effort? We undertook transit-oriented development zoning in our station areas. And the reason we did this is to prepare for the blue line. Having worked in Minneapolis prior to Hiawatha and the green line, we know from experience that you need these regulations in place prior to the line opening because it's coming, the development will come. So, we were really fortunate with our partner, Hennepin County. They secured a Federal Transit Administration grant, and we were able to use that funding to help us develop our ordinance way in advance of the line opening. We already are starting to see that pressure from auto-oriented uses wanting to be in the station areas, and so it just made sense. And we actually had put in a moratorium in June of 2017 to say, wait a second, no, we want to study this and we want to get it right away. So in terms of the process ran from October of 2017, and we had kind of a deadline with that moratorium ticking in June of 2018. And so, we really were intentional in how we thought about what's adoptable. And so we approached it in terms of, single-family areas are not part of this conversation because it's not palatable for this particular political context. And so we really looked at the areas in our station areas that excluded single-family homes. And as a result, the engagement really focused on the businesses in those areas because those were the properties that we were looking at changing the zoning on. We took a lot of effort in making sure that our planning commission and our city council were on board all along, with a lot of work sessions as we did the work, so that they were up to speed and it wasn't a surprise when we came to them for adoption. And then throughout that process, we had community meetings to gauge and take the pulse of residents to see, like, are we going in the right direction? And I think it worked really well. We refined and tinkered along the way. So we didn't really have a large uproar or any sort of opposition. So outside of the TOD zones, this is the parking requirement, just like a smattering of the parking requirements for Brooklyn Park. So for multifamily housing, 2 spaces per unit plus 0.5 space per unit for guests. So that's a lot. It's a lot more than Minneapolis, but that is the traditional suburban context. For retail, 1 space for each 200 square foot of gross floor area. And then for big box, max of 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. But if you look at the commercial area at Brooklyn Boulevard, which has a Target, a Cub Foods, some other large vacant big box, it's never full. It's just super overparked, and it's really not efficient in terms of the land use. So we really sought to try to just take that out of the mix. So in terms of parking in the TOD areas, we focused more on a form-based. We're taking the requirement out and letting the market determine what parking they need. The focus on building form and how much of lot coverage that the building covers helps to kind of balance out that desire to overpark. So we're fine with parking, and we're fine with developers coming up with what they need as long as it behaves in terms of the design. So that's the approach that we took. And this is just kind of an image showing the parking is behind. It can be whatever it needs to be in terms of surface. It doesn't have to be structured underground, but it could be. It just needs, the building has to have the right context to the street. We don't want parking in between a building and the sidewalk anymore. We want it to focus more on the pedestrian. This just gives an example of the facade types. We don't dictate what kind of facade types happen. That's up to the developer and the designer. But this just gives them kind of a visual understanding of what our expectations are in terms of fenestration and access to the street. So this image shows, on the left is the land use plan for Brooklyn Boulevard. And the image on the right is the actual district. And so in terms of, there are 2 districts here for Brooklyn Boulevard. There's a TOD center, which is in the very center of the district. And then to the north is a TOD transition. So we recognize that as the district kind of moves north, there are single-family homes. And so we do want to allow some density there, but we wanted to step back as it goes into the neighborhood. But as of right in the TOD center district, you can have a building of 8 stories. And so we're looking to really redevelop a lot of these overparked surface parking lots, into whatever they want to become. So, we're trying to set the table for new development. This is an example of Oak Grove, which on the left is kind of the illustrative land use plan, and then on the right is the actual zoning district. The boundaries in red are the actual district, and this is greenfield. So this district kind of behaves a little differently in that we allow for a lot of different intensities within the TOD greenfield district to allow some flexibility on the edges. But as this becomes more development ready, we'll come across that as we come across that. But the TODG district, which is in effect, really helps us to focus the density. And that's, being something that's such a large area, we don't want development happening kind of sporadically all over. We want to focus it first in this TODG area. And so Target, they own the majority of the land up here. And so we did a lot of work with them to make sure that they were okay with this approach. And they are comfortable with this approach because it allows them some flexibility with the market. It allows them to focus the area closest to their campus to redevelop into what their employees want, which are bars and restaurants and a more walkable area. So some lessons learned. I think there is a compelling argument to be made to policymakers to let the market dictate the parking instead of government bureaucrats. And so that really worked in our favor, I think, with our policymakers. This is a fairly new TOD zoning ordinance. It was put in place last June. We don't have any active projects in our districts, but we've had a lot of developer interest. And developer interest from folks who have done TOD throughout the Twin Cities. So it gives a signal to the development community that, yeah, we're open to having different types of development than we've had previously. But I think it's really important if you are a suburban community and you're looking to try to do something like this to be realistic in terms of what's going to be palatable to your policymakers. Looking at single-family homes straight out of the gate, we're like, that's not something that we want to try to push the envelope with our particular policy environment. It didn't make sense, and it would have allowed the TOD ordinance would probably have not been adopted had we tried to go that route. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for having me.
So good morning, Dean Dovolis, DJ Architecture. What I want to discuss first is a little bit of the why before the what. And this is a big deal because Jason's work, everyone's work is outstanding, but part of the issue is, does the public want it? Is the public interested in not having parking, bigger densification, all these factors? And what is happening, this is very much what the younger generation of public is wanting to happen, is being proven out in the marketplace. Minneapolis was an early adopter of densification urban centers. This trend started really at the recession and was sort of invisible because there was so much chaos going on, but once the economy came back, the city started densifying and sent out one of the first in the country to have this trend occurred, which is a big deal, and that goes back to the quality of Minneapolis planning going back. Rapidly increasing populations. The Twin Cities is growing from the center out. It used to be from the outside in. This is totally reverse. The greatest growth is in the two center cities. You saw the Met Council numbers that Jason referenced, 46,000 in Minneapolis alone. Those are big numbers, faster or greater number than any other suburb, which is a big deal. Minneapolis is sailing towards 500,000 people. The biggest the city ever was is 532,000 people. It's going to blow past that number with 30% less land because the freeways took a big hunk of it there in the 1950s. Housing is specializing. Micro units, senior units, large units, dormitory style units. Just like what happened in TV, housing is starting to take a broad range of unit types and variety, which is a big deal, which is mean the need of a whole host of populations, from millennials to baby boomers to seniors. Younger generations have different needs. They want experience versus possessions, meaning living in a cool neighborhood is far more significant than having a big house in the suburbs. A big change of thinking, a big change of mentality that's occurring. They're finding other sources of community. It used to be church, family, work. It's now evolving into the community they live in the areas that are living in a cool neighborhood like Lake and Lindale is becoming a big deal. More choices of transportation. This is a burden that the MTC is going to have to handle and really build on. And an increase in rental households, as you can see in the chart, that number, if you look, the renters in the bottom is growing, and that number is taken off, and there's nothing to abate it. Every building we've worked on has filled up, and some have long waiting lists. This little guy show here You think small building would not have been possible if it wasn't for Jason's work in changing the parking ordinances. It's a building that's 10 stories, fits on a 40-foot lot, has 2 parking spaces, 5 bicycle racks, and there's a ton of these going up. But we're working on 60 of them just in our little firm, and you can imagine the rest of the room for them. These small guys is what's starting to change the urban landscape, incremental, one at a time. This hasn't happened since the streetcar era. It is now occurring, and this is really beginning of an urban evolution that's occurring. And these are coming in different ways. This one's built with large bedrooms because some have extended families, others are micro units. But the same idea of small lot design, filling the lot, creating the opportunities and making a more consistent streetscape is occurring on a very rapid basis in a lot of areas. And these are just versions of them that are occurring. To give the example that the new parking ordinance has allowed to occur. This would never have been possible at this stage. Because remember, every enclosed parking space is $25,000, $30,000. You take that out, it makes the housing a lot more affordable and a lot more feasible. We get more units per acre, keeps the costs reasonably down, especially in a high inflationary environment we're dealing with right now on that basis. Same thing, this is a micro unit. Look at the ratio of parking to units. It's very evident in terms of what's going on, in terms of smaller units, less parking, more density that's occurring. Commercial changing. This is Lake in Chicago or Los Campos, and they're moving back in because that's relaxed, more restaurants. Again, back to Jason's point, more commercial diversity, more intensity of the pedestrian experience because there's more building following the streetscape and so forth. Again, Los Campos on the corner, and those little angle things, that's the extent of the parking for the whole development, to give you an idea of the scale. Some cases are using existing parking. The ramp behind this building is creating the inventory for this structure on the corner of Riverside. So we're taking advantage of the parking structure that's there to create that density, allow that occur. And again, you sort of see the stats and then the limited amount of parking that comes with the building. Suburban development, just as mentioned, is releasing. This is in St. Louis Park. What made this feasible to get to scale development is the city is allowing all the streetscape, all the street parking to be counted as part of the development. So the street inventory is being acknowledged and being used to become part of that number and part of the project, which is really a key piece of it. This is Edina. This is a larger project, 30,000 square feet of retail, over 300 apartments. The parking ratio is down now to 3 per 1,000 for all the development. Those aren't unheard of numbers in suburban environments. Big deal in terms of what's occurring, and that allows for restaurants to go in the corner, continue street density, and parking, which is a major deal. And the city is also using this as a regional parking facility, I should district parking facility, in which they tipped the parking so that other developments could use it. These two, same basis. That's Bridgewater headquarters in St. Louis Park. This is a building being built right next to this building, right in the corner. Same ratio, 3 per 1,000 for restaurant and office. All the parking, and this is on ground. Bridgewater chose this location because it's next to the future Southwest Transit line, and that's on Excelsior in Monterey. Same basis. This guy here, the Northeast Office Tower, has 481 spaces packed inside, and this little reverse. The neighborhood wanted parking, so they said, can this building, because the lot's big enough, contain it for the neighborhood so that us that don't have parking, other developments can work. And so the city actually variance for parking, but it's entirely buried within the building, so it's invisible, but serves as what I call a regional parking resource for the neighbors. So there's a lot of variety of ways that this is occurring. So in conclusion, this densification is not going to stop. It'll continue, and my belief is it's going to accelerate. And we have to plan for it because this is what the society is looking for. And as I mentioned before, we're accomplished this in Minneapolis with 30% less land. And we're going to go past 500,000 in Minneapolis. Some projections put it as high as 750 on the basis. And we'll get at that 500,000 mark probably in 5 years. Minneapolis is at 430. as of the last Metro Council city. So what that leads is the innovative transit systems are going to really need to be developed to allow this to continue, because if it doesn't, the system will strangle on itself. So it's really critical of the MTC. Again, we're one of the earliest adopters of this densification, and a unique fact of Minneapolis is that we're one of the few cities that have less miles driven, but have increased its population per year. That's really unique. That's a holy grail of planning. There's only 3 cities that accomplish that. Minneapolis is one that's accomplished with this growth that's occurring. Big deal, big problem. But there will be pain in this process. And I've been thrown out of a few cities proposing this because the idea of density and the others and all those just in the mix. But it's coming, and the suburbs are adapting, Minneapolis are adapted, and really this is really where we're going to be heading, and this is really what we need to be aware of and plan for. So thank you very much.
Good morning. Well, that's a perfect setup to what I want to talk about. Just to give you a quick background on Yellow Tree, what we do. Every one of our developments, as designed, would not have been possible without the changes in ordinance that the city of Minneapolis have. We're an infill developer. We've been around for about 11 years. We're really focused on the entry point market rate housing. It's the largest segment of renters that there is, but no one's building to it. So you have developers that are building low income housing that's highly subsidized, and then you have developers building high-end luxury. So it's there's truly the segment of the rental pool that doesn't have any other options to rent for people making between $30,000 and $60,000. So how do we accomplish that? It's designing properly, efficiently, and then really asking, what do the renters want? What are they using? And how do we design for that pool of people? It's also primarily how to handle parking. I've been in a lot of meetings where parking, it's the driver. It's you sit down, you see your lot, you map out how do you approach a parking. Now you cut out a 65 lineal feet for the parking and what's left over for the building. That's not how we approach any of our developments. So it's really looking at how to properly park, what are people using, but also guiding people and allowing people to come to our buildings that don't have as much parking as a 1-to-1 or even a 2 units or 2 parking spaces per unit. There's only one thing worse than not enough parking, and that's too much parking. Like Dean mentioned, it is expensive. It's really the thing that drives the design. So I want to talk about 3 sites, 3 approaches. Every one of our developments is either close to rail, high frequency bus, bike boulevards, etc. So that's a given. So the 3 sites, they are different. So one is in Northeast Minneapolis. It's a true kind of missing middle design. It's a 4-story. You have single-family duplexes on one side. The other side of the property is high-density commercial. The next 2 are close to Uptown and Lynn Lake. All 3 approaches are different. First, Jack's Apartments. It's project feasibility. So this is in an area where street parking is readily available, but that's not what we want to rely on. We want to rely on proper design and the opportunities that we have because of that. So this was a very difficult site. We're just 90 feet wide, and then I want to say 170 feet long. So what we did is we entered the parking from the alley, wrapping it with active uses. We're about 31, actually we have 31 parking stalls and 67 units. What else this does is just allows further design, further innovation, by not relying on the parking to drive the design. So we have, again, I believe the tagline was to put up a paradise, build over a parking lot. All of our designs have enclosed parking with housing up above. So you have stormwater issues, containment. This one, we have a grant with the Minneapolis watershed to contain rainwater on top of our roof. So it's the first blue roof in Minnesota. That wouldn't have been possible if we just had surface parking lot. The next project, 28th and Garfield, this is close to Lindale, and 28th, right along Lynn Lake. It's truly bringing the same concept that we have for our 4-story product into an area that it supports increased density. So this is a 6-story building. It's still roughly the same lot size, but it has more parking demand, more units, more demand for parking. And what are the ways that we can bring innovation to the design to accomplish a minimum? Again, we're not comfortable with 0 parking spots for all of our buildings, but this is an opportunity for us to still design properly, wrap the building with active uses, and then have the remaining parking be sufficient. We do have a parking stacker for this building that's in these spots. So what it does, it changes 8 parking spots into 24. So it's a triple stacker. You pull into the spot and it relocates your car so then another person can enter. So we went from 24 parking spots plus an additional 12. So we're 67 units and we're about 48 parking spots. The last one I want to briefly talk about is 29th and Bryant. Again, this is right along Lynn Lake, closer to uptown. It has a large parking demand. There's losing streets to both commercial, bike boulevards, and then how do we design for a project that has a larger footprint? This one we have more of a traditional approach. As you can see, we do have underground parking, but then we're still utilizing surface parking lot entered from the back of the building. The main thing to see here is flexibility and able to adapt to what are the future needs. How do we need to park today, and what are we going to be parking at in the future? So that is the main question. This one, we're just off of Lake Street. There was a need or a request from Minneapolis, the neighborhood, Lynn Lake Business District, to maybe we want commercial here, maybe we don't. What can we do? We did move forward with providing walk-up units rather than commercial, but we also have the ability to adapt in the future. So these units could become commercial space in the future, and if there isn't a parking need, they can also take up some of the parking. Enclosure, just a couple points. Again, it's, we believe regulating off-street parking does not provide a benefit to housing. A lot of our housing developments would not have been possible under the old guidelines. It's really allowing us to have the capacity to do innovation, provide what is needed, and then also to provide to people that don't want cars and people that don't have cars.
Thank you. Okay, we're now going to ask our 4 speakers to come up here, and I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience and new questions from everybody, because I'm sure we haven't covered everything about parking today. So give everybody a chance to kind of settle in. And I kind of have a question for Jason. And I think you brought this up kind of at the very beginning. When you change parking requirements off-street, when you change off-street parking, it affects on-street parking in a variety of places. So then we get into the world of curbside management. And so I wanted to know your thoughts on how the city how is that going to be addressed going forward?
Thank you. So one thing the city is tackling right now is an update to our transportation action plan, which will start to tackle some of these on-street parking challenges as well. Right now we have something called critical parking areas, which I don't know that it's working particularly well, but blocks can petition to have permit parking. It is often contentious, and it's sort of a majority rule sort of situation, but oftentimes new development that comes in isn't able to participate rightly or wrongly in the on-street parking situation. So to a large degree, as I kind of referenced at the beginning, we are sort of taking the approach that on-street parking is there, or on-street streets are there partly to accommodate public parking. And in some places, that's just going to be sort of a free-for-all. And that doesn't always go over well with residents nearby, understandably. So we may have to continue to look for additional solutions to that in the future.
I feel sure you will. Okay, and Jennifer, I wanted to ask you, where do you see the next steps in Brooklyn Park?
Sure. So, I think for us, this is a learning time. So we're going to see and test out our ordinance. And, that's the beauty of it. It's not like it's set in stone. So we're going to see what works and maybe what doesn't work and tinker with it. Brooklyn Park is going to go through some growing pains in a transition period. It is going to move from auto-oriented to having some different modes. And so, we have to be realistic and expect that there's going to be some growing pains and some tensions as people start to make that shift. But, as we've seen in Minneapolis, over time, it's a perfect example of incrementalism. You do a little tinkering, see how it works, and then maybe you go a little bit farther. So I think that's what we're going to see as we move forward.
And Rob and maybe Dean also, it's kind of, did you find resistance in the neighborhoods to the type of development that you were proposing?
You want me to go?
I'll go second.
Oh, yes. It is, in some cases, dramatic because it's changed. And sometimes it introduces the other. There's a whole host of reasons. What I've learned is persistence. Water wears down rock, and you just keep coming at it because what is happening, it's generally the older generations, homeowners that have lived there all their lives find this shocking. To the younger generations, they find this normalcy. So it's really trying to bridge that gap and allow for that transition. And we've been through a lot of, comp plan. All the comp plans are being done now. The battles in all these various suburbs is fascinating because these issues are being laid out in comprehensive plans and debate on density, parking, versus how much growth they're accepting and so forth. So yeah, this is very real and being played out with all these comp plans are being submitted and negotiated with various city councils.
I agree with that. It has changed probably over the past 3 years when we started working with neighborhood groups. It also depends on the neighborhood. The difference between a Whittier neighborhood, an uptown Lynn Lake, and then a northeast. So there's a fear of the unknown. How is this going to affect me? How is it going to affect the businesses? But it is truly speaking to having an approach to parking, telling them what you're providing, why you're providing it, and for what reason. It's, just having a fully integrated company where we do design, we construct our own projects, and we're also doing property management. We see how the projects are renting out, what parking is used where, and then how much. So our initial studies are actually being implemented, and it's comforting to see that the parking that we provide is usually renting up. So for 50% leased, 50% of the parking is being taken. So if you can tell that to the neighborhood and have them know that you are thoughtful about parking, that goes a long way.
Okay, if you want to hand your mic over, because I think having too close together was the problem.
Keep
So, 2 and 2.
separated.
Anyway, and this is a question for all four of you. One of the things, traditionally, we have seen neighborhood opposition to a variety of changes because as Rob said, a lot of people aren't comfortable with change. You know, they bought it. It's like from the moment they bought it, they want no change. You know, or from the moment they moved into the neighborhood, they want no change. I moved here from Austin, Texas, and we used to joke that people who had been there in Austin for 3 months would say, you know, it just isn't what it used to be. And so, and they were right, but still. Anyway, so I want to ask about something that I have observed that's, I think, kind of new. There's a group in this region and other regions that is actively asking for more development. And in this region, I think it's a beautifully named organization, or very cleverly named. It's called Neighbors for More Neighbors. And I wondered if you had encountered this in your work, all four of you. So I'll start with you, Jason.
Sure. Certainly something that has been new during my time with the city has been an increased advocacy for construction of additional housing and more sustainable options in terms of transportation. So that is, when we first started working on parking issues 10 years ago, there was fairly little interest at that time in the ordinances that we were looking at. On either side, there was not a lot of opposition to reducing parking requirements back in 2009, but likewise, there was a fairly limited amount of advocacy as well, and we're seeing that change for sure, where people are proactively coming out and advocating, seeing the connection between parking and climate change and other issues that they care about.
Okay, I'll pass it.
So we haven't had any sort of interaction with the group that you referenced, but I do think that there is a growing recognition in Brooklyn Park that there is definitely some missing housing types and products that community doesn't have. So, you know, it's lots of 1960s, 1970s one-bedroom apartment units, low amenity, and then single-family homes. And so I think there is a recognition in the community that there is a need for some different styles and types. And so while it's still in its infancy in terms of densification, people calling for density, I think that there's a recognition of a need for different housing types and styles.
Okay, if you would hold on to that mic and let them, we need to preserve a little distance.
Yeah, I agree. I think what it allows is, it allows for change. It allows us to adapt. It allows us to have innovation. So a lot of this wouldn't have been possible with the old ordinances. It's the way that we approach parking, the way that we look at how we attract renters, how we keep renters. We see it as three segments. There's the people that don't have cars, there's the people that don't want cars, and there's people that never get rid of their car. You know, designing for the people and not, you know, it's people that don't have cars, they can live anywhere. You know, they can go to someone that has proper parking, less parking, no parking. We really want to build to people that don't want cars. So how do you do that? We're looking at systems where there's an apartment car, so there's going to be solar on the roof, powering an electrical vehicle, and there's an opportunity for people to shed their car knowing that they have the comfort of a car in the vehicle, that they can make a 2-hour drive to St. Cloud to see their parents, come back, and then it can be checked out by someone else. It's truly innovation and ways to solve the problem without just providing more vehicles, one-to-one parking.
I've had the privilege to work with Neighbors for Neighbors. Huge help, because you do get overwhelmed on these projects in terms of neighborhood responses against it. And Neighbors and Neighbors have been the positive voice, because unfortunately, when there's the public hearing component, the people are against it, always show up, the people are for it, they whisper to you, hope you get done, because they don't want to speak publicly in front of their neighbors that they're supportive of the development. So they've been gracious in helping us on a lot of our projects, explaining why it's important, and helping with the public testimony part of it. So yeah, that's been a big positive. You don't feel so alone out there anymore.
Okay, and on that note, I want to open it up to the audience. I have just 2 rules for questions. And the first rule is that the first sentence is ended with a question mark. And the second rule is there is no second sentence. So we'll now open it, because I want to get as many questions as possible. So we'll now open this up for questions, and we'll start with this gentleman over here. And we have a mic.
This is I live near the Ford site in St. Paul. 6,000 or 7,000 new residents, workers, customers. Ryan asked to double the parking, and they got the variance. My question is, at what point, and what does the data say about mode switch due to congestion? If we're reducing parking to no minimum or zero or some very much smaller ratio, we're relying on congestion to switch people from modes, it seems to me, in a certain sense. So what does the data say from all your different perspectives about when people who have been driving actually switch and don't drive? I'm just curious.
It's already happening. The trend has already started. These developments you see with zero parking, we're not selling out the parking spaces, even in the ones where we do provide parking, meaning there's more and more residents opting not to have a car. And really what I didn't mention, because in a presentation, Uber, Lyft, those other sources are starting to fill a transit infrastructure in urban areas that are becoming much more reliable. So already that has been established. I don't, some of these apartments may charge $75 to $125 per space. They're going wanting. We may be, in the projects I've been involved with, selling half to 2/3 of the spaces because, especially in the urban locations, because of these other methods that they're relying on. They're starting to take car out of the equation, so the trend's already begun.
I would cautiously agree with that. And I think part of it's because of the segment that we're focused on providing to the entry point market rate housing. They're making life choices. They have a budget. Do they want to live in an older style building with no amenities? Do they want to pay a little bit more for housing? They have a finite budget, so they're not having cars. We see it in all the neighborhoods. A lot of the neighborhoods that have active participants, they don't have cars or they don't want cars. It's truly up to us to help them get rid of a car if they don't want it, and it goes back to providing that service for them within our building. I think that's going to be a great approach and something that we're going to implement moving forward.
I'm wondering if future parking reform is going to mean more on-street metered parking in high-demand areas.
I think that's going to be a big conversation in the Transportation Action Plan that we're currently working on. And so that would be a fairly new thing for us, particularly on residential streets. We've relied mostly on the critical parking areas. So we will have a discussion and see how much acceptance there would be of actual kind of paid metered parking on residential streets. I think that's very untested in this market.
Well, and if I could add from some other cities, sometimes it ends up being mixed, permit and metered, and sometimes it's time of day, and there are a lot of variations, and Jason is going to have a lot of interesting conversations.
I can speak to it from my experience working in Minneapolis. Can you hear me correctly? Okay. In terms of,
Here, you need this one.
yeah, let's just switch up. So working in Minneapolis and in the university area around Prospect Park, I was the community planner there. There was a lot of NIMBYs who were just like, absolutely not, we don't want any change. But we do want a grocery store, and we want all these services, and we want all these great stores. And so, yes, I have witnessed changeover from NIMBYs to YIMBYs in that context when they realized, oh, we can have the kind of development we want with the stuff we want, as long as we can kind of help shape it. So my experience, yes.
I'm not sure. I really don't know. I think we've had quite a few projects in the Whittier neighborhood. 2 years ago when we presented, it was exactly that. We're presenting again tonight for the third time for a project on 26th. In Blaisdell, I would say they probably didn't go from a no to yes, but they went from a no to okay, or we agree with your approach. If they're excited about it, I wouldn't go that far.
All I'm going to say is the one on Signature in France took 4 years to get it through. First meeting, they had signs up with DJ with a slash through it. It was just outstanding. I call it the erosion rate, which started at 200 people, eroded to 100 to 75 to 50 to 25 as people slowly understood it, and the council kept making presentations. The one thing unique about that project, some of the most outstanding presentations, which really helped convince the neighbors, was the council presentations favor the project. The one councilman put a whole PowerPoint on density. It was Mike Fisher. Take an example at walk, which a lot of you know, and walk through the whole thing, why this makes sense. So that's probably the biggest example of seeing this, but in the conversion of council. So it does happen, but it takes time.
I actually once had a training called the Systematic Development of Informed Consent. Not consensus, not agreement, but somebody who could get to zero. So it is possible. I'm going to go to the back there.
I work with ABC Ramps, and we've surveyed all our customers and people that live and work downtown. And what we're finding is people say, well, I have to drive all the time because on my first day of my job, I'm either given the choice of a parking contract or a transit pass. And because I need to drive sometimes for various reasons, kid pickup, class, meeting with clients, then I'm going to choose to drive all the time. So we're forcing a lot of people to drive all the time when they'd be willing to do a little bit of each. And that requires, parking operators to provide flexibility, for Metro Transit to provide flexibilities, and then employers to offer that as pre-tax benefits. So just curious if you've thought about any of that, forcing parking and driving on a commuter side.
Well, I'm just going to answer that from the transit agency side. Obviously, we have a missed opportunity here, and we definitely need to work together and figure out our employee pass program, Metro Transit's in downtown, is wildly successful. We have a really high rate of people coming into downtown without driving by themselves. I think it's like 40%. So obviously, we're missing an opportunity here. And one of the newer parking strategies for ramps is to have a daily rate that when you hit the cap, Thrivent does this, a daily rate, and when you hit like 6 in a month, then you're not charged after that. Your pass thing doesn't get charged, so it's like our go-to card. And that it means people who drive a few times drive and pay, but it means every time they do, the monthly rate's just still capped out there, but every time they do, they realize parking costs money. And we found that's pushed a lot of people to transit, and just that consciousness of how much parking costs every day. Does anybody else want to comment on the challenge of the commuter and the need to drive sometime in the transit pass?
Well, I think definitely the loss of car-to-go, the flexible car share has been a real detriment. I think being able to have that flexibility made it much more pleasant for people to feel like they could, commit to transit and then still have that option to be able to drive when they need to drive.
And just find out some of the larger developments, we've added pool cars to the project, meaning a car that's parked permanently in a location, like 2 or 3, tend to be electric vehicles, that people could use to do daily commutes back and forth, that they can run out, lease out for a couple hours and so forth.
So lots of good ideas out there. Let's see, I'm here on the aisle. Yes, you.
Hi, I'm just wondering, and I may have a...
If you would stand up, because then people can hear you better.
Hi, I may have been asking the wrong question or wrong audience, but have any of you experienced any pushback conversation from lenders or financing who don't care that there's 0 parking requirements, but they need it on their books?
That is a fantastic question. Let's start down there.
When we started, for history, they looked for a 1.5 ratio. If you didn't have that, the banks wouldn't touch it. It's not going to be financially feasible, son. Ain't going to work. That's since gone to 1 and now to 0.5. The lending community is willing to accept the 0.5 ratio, which is a huge shift from what it was. But your question is very good, because the silent hand that drives all this development is the lenders and the requirements of what they want to see in the development. But they are starting to look at 0.5 as a financeable project now, provided the transit infrastructure is reasonably available.
I agree. There has been a difference 4 years ago to us getting financing just last week. It does depend on the lender, the question is asked, but we've never had a problem lately getting financing based upon reduced parking requirements. So more open to it.
Jennifer?
Well, Brooklyn Park, we let the developer decide what the parking is. So, depending on what the lender's requirements are and how the building layout, hopefully that will be a winning combination.
So does anybody else have a question back there?
Going back to the on-street parking conversations. Obviously, you know, parking light developments do push more cars to be parked on the street. But in a lot of cities not named Minneapolis and St. Paul, they have winter overnight parking bans. I think probably the majority of Twin Cities suburbs, with the exception of kind of some legacy towns like Hopkins, just straight up don't allow overnight parking in the winter. And that presents a problem, I think, for, you know, looking at changing parking requirements and having parking-like developments in the suburbs. So a question for Jennifer. While you were talking, I looked at Brooklyn Park, and they have the overnight parking ban as well. Is that something that you've looked at all, perhaps in these TOD station areas, that Brooklyn Park would allow overnight parking year-round?
Right, it is definitely something we've considered. I know that for our community outside of the station areas is where we have the bulk of the one-bedroom unit kind of concentration, where that is really a huge issue. In our TOD areas, we don't have that. So we hope that as development happens or redevelopment happens, that it can accommodate parking in a way that works for both the neighborhood as well as the development. Now, if it were different, if those TOD areas included the areas around Zane where the one bedroom, I think it would be a different conversation. I think we'd be taking a different approach.
Good question, though. And is there any, oh, back there.
Maybe a question for our city representatives. What do we do about large parking ramps that are proposed in or near TOD overlay areas? I'm thinking Federal Reserve Bank and other projects like that, to get political. But what tools out there is a transportation plan that City Minneapolis is looking at to address big projects like that?
I think that's a Jason one. Did everybody hear the question? Okay, good.
So the question was how we should address larger scale parking garages like the current one that we're seeing from the Federal Reserve Bank. I think we acknowledge at the city that parking has gotten tight in the North Loop. I mean, you try to find an on-street spot, it's become more tight in the North Loop, and fortunately, a lot of the lots are disappearing because they're being redeveloped. The Federal Reserve is making the case that they would rather not spend the kind of money that they're looking to invest in a really large parking structure, but they feel like they have no other reasonable options. You know, we have parking maximums. That's a project, for example, that complies with its parking maximum. We have relatively flexible parking maximums, although they are more strict in downtown than elsewhere. But to some degree, we subscribe to the philosophy that Jen mentioned of sort of letting the market operate within some reasonable parameters of either very low or no minimums and some fairly reasonable maximums. You know, we adopted some strict design regulations related to parking structures that will hopefully help us ensure that parking structures don't detract from the walking environment or other modes. But certainly there's the possibility that if we're building large structures, parking structures right now, that there's going to be widespread kind of kicking ourselves 10, 15 years from now. You know, I think one thing that we're going to look at in the near future is ensuring that when you provide parking, that a percentage of those have charging stations or are EV ready. You know, that's not the entire solution, but it's part of the solution to the situation that we're currently in, where you know, maybe 20 years from now or whatever the horizon is for widespread adoption of autonomous vehicles, if you believe that is a significant solution to our transportation issues. You know, until such time, we've got to figure out how to address what is as hard to deny as sort of a shortage in the North Loop right now. I've been encouraged to see how many people have been getting off the train to go to the North Loop, because I I fear for some of the larger office buildings that we're developing in the North Loop, I fear what the mode split is going to be on some of those, because I know I've seen examples of companies that you would think would have a very high mode split, but if they're just ways outside the downtown core, they have a surprisingly large single occupancy vehicle share in their mode split. So,
And I want to ask you just a quick follow-up. Does the city require a transportation management plan or a transportation demand management plan? And are they required to come talk to Metro Transit about employee pass programs?
good question. We do have a travel demand management ordinance. It's not a great ordinance. As part of some upcoming regulatory reform work, we are looking at a pretty significant overhaul to that ordinance and hopefully providing a lot more predictability for developers. Right now, it's sort of a negotiated process. Oftentimes, it's not even required by ordinance, but Public Works orders what's called a discretionary travel demand management plan. So we hope to make it much more clear sort of which projects it applies to, what the expected mitigation measures are going to be for different uses or different scales of projects. And certainly participation in things like MetroPass are things that we look for through that TDM plans.
Great. Are there any more questions? Oh, here we go.
My observation waiting for the bus each day is that there's 10 or 11 vehicles with one person in them for every one that has two people. And there's almost none with three. It just seems like there's huge potential to try to just increase that taking cars off the road could be a pretty easy win.
Do you see any impact on your renters that have kids and if they're able to deal with less parking?
We're having less kids and having kids later and marrying later, which is really part of the drive that's occurring here. And that's sort of been the response on that basis. Right now, how kids are being handled as a Lyft Uber system is what's people that stay in urban environments, you know, they may have a car or they may use that system to transport kids. I'm starting to see that as a growing piece of it. But I haven't seen a major, right now, that millennial generation hasn't quite pushed into the childbearing area, so we don't know, you know, but we're just seeing the edges of it. So a lot of it's going to be speculation still on that.
Well, and I just have to say, we've talked a lot about millennials moving into these places, but they are not the only ones.
Yes, correct.
As somebody who likes the maintenance-free lifestyle.
I agree with what Dean said. You know, it is our target market. I would say 70 to 80% of our renters are under the age of 35, maybe 36. We do have families. I'd have to check with our leasing agent how many of them will actually have cars. I would assume a majority of them. But what we're seeing right now is people want to live alone. That's what it is. They want to get out of a roommate situation. So our studios and one bedrooms, they're the first ones to lease up. We're having trouble with 2 bedrooms. Some of our 2 bedrooms are going to families, but it's pretty rare.
Okay, I saw another question over here.
I'm curious about the aesthetics of parking, and especially when it's exposed, not inside the buildings. Parking garages, for example, and outdoor parking. It seems like there's opportunities to use those spaces for other things when there's no cars in them, for community engagement activities, or to just aesthetically treat them so they aren't the ugliest parts of our cities. So I'm interested in what's being done about the way parking looks.
And I gotta give credit to Jason. That last building I showed has 481 parking spaces. 2 things we did. All the floor plates are flat and they're higher so they could convert to uses. But the Minneapolis ordinance has written that you cannot expose parking to any public way. It has to be wrapped by active uses. And that was a battle with that developer. It was not an easy thing, to be truthful. That was a great tug of war on that process. So I'm going to say Minneapolis has actually instituted that if you have to do a public ramp, it has to be underground. If it's service to the building, we bump around, it has to be active use. So Minneapolis has gone a long ways in terms of that, because we were one of the guinea pigs that really broke their ordinance with a major parking facility on a building.
And that's a relatively new ordinance, so some of the structures you see that are several years old would not have had to have complied with that. So it's sort of a new experiment for us, and there are abilities to ask for exceptions to it. But yeah, we have really tried to take a big step to limit how much of the public realm is parking, either surface parking or parking structure.
Yeah, and Jennifer? Yeah.
So in our ordinance, we have a frontage requirement, so with the building. So, our adage of making parking behave, really the building design and how it's placed on the lot and how it interacts with the parking really comes into play, so that you don't interact with a surface lot if it is surface parking. It's going to be tucked away or hidden behind and not so prevalent and kind of the main focal point of the development.
And there's another question right here.
Yeah, a question for Dean and the creative approach St. Louis Park took in allowing credit for the on-street parking spaces. I was wondering if that credit sunsetted in any way. So I imagine Public Works may come in with the street project and they would like to revisit the curbside use from parking to, say, expanded sidewalk or bike lane. So is it forever? And does that give neighbors a reason to not get rid of parking if it's maybe there's a better use in the future?
It is forever as much as the street stays there. I mean, it's not like deeded as permanent in the city. They just look at their street that any frontage your property abuts, you can count those spaces for your development. They're not reserved, they're still open to the public, but they go towards your count on the project, which really is, like I say, that's really helpful because it just helps tighten up the development and get more activity in place with it. So I can just say I appreciated that approach.
There's one back there. Yeah.
This is probably a question for Rob and maybe Dean. If I don't have a car, can I park my cargo bike and maybe my 3 or 4 other bikes in that parking stacker thing, which would make me feel really Dutch?
They do have bike stackers. We're not putting them in any of our buildings, but what I would say, for all of our projects, the only thing that's getting larger is the bike parking.
Yeah.
Our bike rooms, we're doing bike lounges, we're providing amenities for bikers. So while the units are getting smaller, we're parking it less. The one thing that is getting bigger is bike lounges and bike storage.
Yeah,
But that was a great question about, cargo bikes and other bikes that they don't fit in the traditional bike space. And so accommodating those is a new challenge for everybody here. So, right here.
This is a question for anybody, but can you describe a little bit about the ordinance writing process? Like, was there a lot of consultation with developers, between the city and developers? Was there built-in flexibility? Or, how did you kind of write the ordinances that you have related to parking?
You want to? So we did consult developers, and we did, it was an iterative process. And so, we talked with developers, we talked with our policymakers, and, worked back and forth in terms of what was workable for our market.
Yes, we've tried to engage pretty broadly, including internally, and working with other departments that have an interest in parking, including Public Works, of course. And I think a key thing is parking has such a broad kind of impact that it's helpful to help people make the connections between parking and things that they care about, be it stormwater management or climate change or urban design issues, and just help people kind of see those connections. It kind of helps them bring them around to the flexibility in minimum parking requirements approach.
Okay, this back there.
This question's for Jason. You had stated a couple questions ago that a lot of the development in North Loop is a little too far away from the stations to where there's a lot of people driving there. Is there any general trends emerging as to like how far is too far from a station? I work with the Metropolitan Council, and most of the times we consider the sphere of influence for a station to be half a mile. Are we planning right or wrong, or any insight into that?
Yeah, good question. And I think that's been sort of our rule of thumb as well. I mentioned the parking reduction ordinance that it applies to half-mile radius of frequent rail service, and with the idea that with the higher quality and more frequent the transit services, the more people are going to be willing to walk greater distances to it. I think that quarter-mile to half-mile range is pretty reasonable. I think once you start getting farther than that, you're relying on really pretty hardcore transit riders to expect them to walk more than a half mile to transit.
My name's Mary, and I work with the Downtown Minneapolis Transportation Management Organization. Several of my colleagues are here today. We provide services, thanks to the Met Council, to any downtown company, whether it's relocating to downtown or already here. And now I'm going to digress a little, because this weekend we were at Open Doors, and I had my millennial son with me, who has some money because he's employed. And we went over to the Federal Reserve, and we stood in the middle of their proposed parking ramp. And I said, "What do you think? What is this parcel good for?" He said, "This is probably the best residential parcel in the city."
It is.
So back to the TMO. We would love to work with any company that's facing, a $20 or $30 million parking bill, when maybe that could be better used for residential purposes.
I'd be happy to help make that connection.
Okay, this whole thing has been worth it right there. No, any more questions? And thank you very much for saying that, Mary.
Question for Dean. In your presentation, you mentioned a reasonable projection of Minneapolis population reaching 500,000, but is there any forecasting of what the demographics are of that growth, their age, income levels? Is it how much of a combination of the birth rate, people already in the region but moving into the city, people coming from other places into Minneapolis?
That's an outstanding question. You hit on something. Historically, we grew by birth rate and not by immigration. That's historic. This is from the census since, and I hope I get this right, 2000, we're getting 84,000 net migrants into the area. That's never happened before, except when the area was settled. And so that's a major change, because the job market is so strong. We're pulling people into the metropolitan area, so it's not births that are creating our growth anymore, because that's been declining at a pretty steady rate. It's net immigration of professionals, primarily filling the job market, which is almost insatiable in terms of managing it. So that's really what's the new driver, and not the historic method of births versus deaths.
Any more questions? Okay, we're actually, I can't believe this, but we're actually a little bit early here. So I want to encourage everybody to talk to your neighbors and have one more pastry and a little coffee on the way out. And I want to thank Nick Koch and HGA again. And I want to thank our fantastic panel. Everybody.